In July 1969, NASA was preparing for its first attempt to land a man on the moon. Billions of dollars of new hardware had been developed in a hurry because America was under pressure.
1, 0, all engine running.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things. Not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
In the early 1960s, the Soviet Union had been dominating space exploration. America was struggling to keep up. The race to the moon became a unique proxy war against the forces of world communism. America had emerged from World War II in a strong position. Its immense wartime manufacturing capacity had effortlessly adapted to peace, now making all manner of consumer goods for the richest country on earth. The US military was returning to its reduced peacetime numbers, secure in the knowledge that America was the only nation with the new super weapon. It was argued that, in the hands of democracy, this would be a force for peace. In Moscow, Joseph Stalin had different ideas about how the peace should be shaped. The Soviet Union had isolated Eastern Europe, installing puppet governments, and it had the military strength to convince these countries to remain loyal. The balance changed in 1949 when a US B-29 detected radioactivity above the northern Pacific, confirming that the Soviet Union had detonated an atom bomb.
The Japanese began the war.
President Truman, who had authorized the nuclear attacks on Japan, had been advised the Russians would eventually develop a nuclear device, but this was years ahead of the best estimates. US intelligence had underestimated the Soviets. The headlines made America frightened, and the Cold War had started.
One of the greatest peacetime spy dramas reaches its...
The Soviets' rapid mastery of the bomb had come about through espionage. American citizens Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed for passing nuclear secrets to the Russians. President Truman dramatically increased funding for weapons research, including the accelerated development of missile technology. Both the United States and the Soviet Union had been experimenting with German V-2 rockets captured in the closing days of the Second World War.
Ignition. Liftoff.
The idea of fitting a rocket with a nuclear warhead had taken hold in military minds. Along with the captured hardware, a large cohort of German rocket engineers had been brought to the United States. They had come voluntarily under the Truman administration's Operation Paperclip. Conveniently, no questions were asked about possible Nazi connections. The group was led by the chief designer of the V-2, Werner von Braun. He had delivered drawings and specifications for the rocket, including suggested improvements. In 1950, the Cold War became hot, with the United States entering the conflict in Korea against forces backed by the Soviets and the Chinese. Civilian losses were horrendous. It pushed America's investments in weapons to new levels. Further complications came with the US testing the hydrogen bomb, a weapon so powerful it was said to be unusable. At this time in America, the Army, the Air Force and the Navy all had separate programs for missile development, and a number of different companies were taking contracts for differing systems. The Army focused on missiles as a new, longer-range form of artillery. The Air Force did not immediately take ground-launched rockets seriously. They understood that the nation's air wing enjoyed overwhelming superiority. This Quail missile was not a weapon. Released from a bomber, it acted as an electronic decoy. The US Navy had no success launching liquid-fueled rockets from a pitching boat deck and were developing rockets for scientific research. Soviet efforts were concentrated in one organization, which avoided the development duplication experienced in the United States. Early in 1953, Dwight Eisenhower was sworn in as the 34th American president. A man accustomed to leadership, he had served as the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in Europe during the Second World War. As president, his aim was to limit Soviet expansion, and relatively inexpensive nuclear weapons seemed like a good option.
Is not complete.
In months, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin was dead. Eisenhower tried to reset relations with the Soviet Union, but his efforts to curb the growing arms race came to nothing. In August 1953, the Russians demonstrated their own hydrogen weapon in tests at Semipalatinsk. Cold War tensions increased, and so did weapons research. In the United States, military leaders now turned to weapons with a greater reach. Intelligence reports suggested that the Soviet Union was working on missiles, and American media coined the term missile gap. Fearing that the US was falling behind, the Secretary of Defense waved through increased missile expenditure. The Army established the Army Ballistic Missile Agency, staffed by an experienced team of rocket engineers, including the Germans from Operation Paperclip. The Air Force revived the stalled Atlas program for a new rocket that included several innovations, but it would need a lot more work. The Navy was concentrating on the Vanguard launcher. With it, they hoped to orbit a research satellite.
We meet again as upon a like moment 4 years ago, and again.
By 1957, when President Eisenhower was re-elected, a small part of the celebratory parade included a Redstone missile. While presidential inaugurations always included military marching and military bands, military hardware was something new. For decades, polar research had been a field in which international collaboration had delivered breakthroughs in understanding the atmosphere, weather, and geomagnetism. The research had been coordinated by the International Meteorological Organization. In 1882, and again in 1932, the IMO had declared International Polar Years. It was decided to extend this research to the entire planet, with the International Council of Scientific Unions naming 1957-58 the International Geophysical Year. Both the White House and the Kremlin said they would launch a satellite as part of the scientific investigations. The Semyorka was designed as the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile. It could deliver a 6-ton warhead to a target 8,000 kilometers distant. Yet its very first mission was entirely peaceful. On October the 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union successfully launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. It contained a radio transmitter that could easily be monitored. Anyone around the globe who had a ham radio could verify that Sputnik existed. People could even see a faint dot as it crossed the sky. The US had no knowledge that the Russians could do this. What followed became known as the Sputnik crisis.
I guess the American people are alarmed that a foreign country, especially an enemy country, can do this, and we fear this.
2 days after the launch of Sputnik, the Soviet Union detonated a thermonuclear device above Novaya Zemlya. The American people could not help linking the two events. The next Soviet surprise was a dog called Laika. Sealed inside a capsule, she had food, water, and air to breathe. Sputnik 2 achieved orbit on the 3rd of November 1957, the 40th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. It was a much larger, heavier spacecraft than its predecessor. For America, the Sputniks were a threat to national security, and pressure mounted on President Eisenhower.
Our satellite program has never been conducted as a race with other nations. Rather, it has been carefully scheduled as part of the scientific work of the International Geophysical Year. I consider our country's satellite program to be well designed and properly scheduled to achieve the scientific purposes for which it was initiated. Vanguard has not had equal priority with that accorded our ballistic missile work.
The most reliable rocket that the US had was the Army's Redstone, but because it was designed as a weapon, the President prohibited it from making America's response. The Vanguard, intended for research, would launch America's first satellite. A Vanguard test flight, Test Vehicle 3, was hastily repurposed for the attempt. Vanguard satellite weighed 1.5 kilograms. Sputnik 1 had weighed more than 83 kilograms. Sputnik 2 was more than 500 kilograms.
2, 1.
The launch was carried on TV live, coast to coast. For America, it was an intense humiliation. President Eisenhower yielded, giving the Army permission to make an attempt. Much of the preparatory work had already been done. A variant of the Redstone missile, the Juno 1, was fitted with solid-fueled upper stages from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. The satellite, known as Explorer 1, was also built by JPL with the scientific payload designed by Dr. James Van Allen. The night of January the 31st, 1958. Explorer 1 successfully entered orbit. It was equipped with a cosmic ray detector, and it relayed information that led to the discovery of the Van Allen radiation belts.
T-minus 5 seconds and counting. Mark.
During 1958, the US made 15 further orbital attempts with a variety of repurposed military rockets.
Here she goes.
Only 4 of these were successful. But while America was outnumbering the Soviets in launches, they were still far behind in the weight that they could send to orbit. American rocket designers understood that it would be several years before they could retool to build launchers that matched Russian capability. In the US, at the Army Ballistic Missile Agency, a design process had started for a much larger launcher that could be developed in quick time. The agency would proceed with the large booster program led by Wernher von Braun. "1958 was an eventful year. The National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics had been carrying out high-speed, high-altitude flights with a series of experimental aircraft, and the Eisenhower administration decided the research agency's remit should be expanded to include flights to space. NACA would become NASA. NASA absorbed NACA along with the Lewis, Langley and Ames research centers. Soon the Jet Propulsion Laboratory was included, and the major part of the ABMA, which became NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center. Eisenhower was keen to break the connection between the military and space with a well-funded civilian space agency. One of NASA's first actions was to introduce America's first 7 astronauts. Yet no one was even sure if a human could survive in space. Initially called Project Astronaut, the mission was soon changed to Project Mercury, drawing on classical mythology. Its primary aim was to beat the Russians. To get an American in orbit as soon as possible, a group within NASA called the Space Task Group designed a spacecraft that drew heavily on research into atmospheric re-entry of nuclear warheads. A blunt body shape that would hit the air rear first emerged. To the annoyance of the men who would fly in it, the Mercury spacecraft became known as a capsule. Radio equipment, life support, navigation and control systems were all crammed into the titanium cone. The astronaut was crammed in as well. The capsule was regarded as an experimental craft, and no thought was given to ease of maintenance. Even the hatch was bolted in place. There seemed no point in finer design features in an item that would be used only once. The new astronauts were all highly accomplished test pilots. Their new training program included publicity sessions. Right from the beginning, it was understood that high levels of funding could only be maintained if the space program enjoyed public support. It took America's new heroes some time to adjust to the scrutiny. Training and testing often merged, with medical researchers simply wanting to find out the limits of human endurance. Extremes in temperature and G-forces could be expected in spaceflight, so the astronauts were tested in the lab first. At the same time, behind the Iron Curtain, a similar group of cosmonauts was undergoing a very similar training. Everything about the Soviet space program remained secret. Only after an initiative was successful would news be released to the public. In contrast, NASA was completely open, sharing with the world its plans for the future. Relentless promotion of the 7 Mercury astronauts had given them rock star status. Yet the US military was heavily involved in space too, and their activities were secret, like the Russians. After a US spy plane had been shot down over the Soviet Union, American intelligence had been working on spy satellites. Later, the Air Force recruited its own secret team of astronauts. To send humans to space, both sides would rely upon launchers that had been, or were being, developed as weapons. The Soviets were adapting the R-7 that launched Sputniks 1 and 2, while the Americans would use a version of the Redstone for introductory short flights. It was not powerful enough to lift an astronaut to orbit. NASA planned to use a variant of the Atlas missile for the Mercury program's orbital flights. There were problems with the development of the Atlas. It cannot have been easy for the astronauts. For a spacecraft that had to protect its human cargo in space and during the intense heat of re-entry, NASA drew upon research for nuclear warheads that also had to re-enter the atmosphere. The astronaut would breathe pure oxygen, both from his spacesuit and within the capsule. Eliminating nitrogen would save weight and prevent the bends if there was a sudden decompression. By contrast, the Soviets' heavy lift capability gave their designers more scope. The Vostok spacecraft consisted of a heavy spherical crew module with a detachable support module that was discarded before re-entry. Yet problems with the Semyorka would delay Soviet attempts to launch a man into space. Reliability issues weighed heavily on the minds of NASA's spacecraft designers, so tests began on an escape system. A solid-fueled escape rocket attached to the top of the Mercury capsule would pull the spacecraft clear should the launcher explode. It was tested in flight on a custom-made launcher called Little Joe. At this stage, all eyes were on every launch of the Atlas rocket.
T-minus 5 seconds and counting. Mark. Mission start. T0. Here she goes.
In January 1961, the torch was passed to a new generation of Americans with the inauguration of President John Kennedy. During his election campaign, he was insistent that the United States needed to catch up with the Soviet lead in space technology. He quickly accelerated NASA's large booster program, but because of its huge expense, he was reluctant to fund recommendations made in feasibility studies for a moon flight. The Redstone rocket, scheduled to make the first manned flights, had been extensively modified to carry the Mercury capsule. It had been lengthened to carry more fuel, and the fuel itself had been changed to deliver more thrust. However, the Redstone was old technology. It was only capable of taking an astronaut for a 15-minute hop from Cape Canaveral to a point in the Atlantic. This was criticized as a gimmick. It was said that anything short of an orbit was meaningless. But American pride had been seriously damaged by the Sputnik launches, and NASA was determined to be first to send a human into space, even if it was only for a few minutes. Two test flights of the Mercury-Redstone combination were scheduled before a manned flight was to be attempted. NASA would not wait for the Atlas, hoping to grab the prestige of first man in space. 3-year-old Ham was to be the first great ape in space. His training taught him to pull on a lever to receive a banana pellet, which some in the astronaut corps felt made a mockery of their role. He was strapped into a pressurized compartment that served as a spacesuit. This was fortunate because a fault in the Mercury capsule led to a severe drop in oxygen pressure that could have killed him. Again, the Redstone flew a much steeper path than intended, and Ham's capsule landed 77 kilometers beyond the planned impact site. The chimp had experienced 14 Gs on re-entry, and the Mercury capsule had been damaged on impact and was taking on water. Ham had survived, and the flight was called a success, but too many things had gone wrong to enable an astronaut to make the next flight. Werner von Braun insisted upon another flight to iron out difficulties with the rocket. At this time, the mass media was focusing on who would be America's first man in space. NASA had released a shortlist: John Glenn, Gus Grissom, or Alan Shepard.
Scene one, take one.
NASA was keen to keep its efforts in the public eye.
I am Alan B. Shepard, one of the 7 Mercury astronauts.
I am John Glenn, one of our astronauts who is preparing for our first manned ballistic flights into space.
The sound for Gus Grissom's contribution has not been preserved, but it appears that he was not a smooth media performer. The Mercury 7 were exposed to a wide range of experiences to prepare them for space, or the consequences of malfunctioning hardware. None like the high-G centrifuge at the Naval Air Development Center. By contrast, zero-G flights aboard a C-131 looked like fun. But the Soviets were preparing another surprise. His name was Yuri Gagarin. On April the 12th, 1961, Gagarin became the first man in space. His Vostok 1 spacecraft made a complete orbit of the Earth, returning safely to the ground near the village of Smilovka. Yuri Gagarin was feted as a hero throughout the Soviet Union and across the world. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev understood the prestige associated with his country's success in space. In the United States, there was disappointment. It did not matter that the US at that time had successfully launched 32 satellites compared to the Soviet Union's 11. The Russians were doing things first, and the American public did not like being beaten by communists. At NASA, their plan for a first manned flight continued. Alan Shepard would make America's first attempt. 3 weeks after Gagarin's flight, in the pre-dawn on May the 5th, technicians were preparing the Mercury-Redstone combination. Shepard's Mercury capsule number 7 he named Freedom 7. Because there were 7 Mercury astronauts, the 7 stuck as part of the naming convention for subsequent Mercury flights. Shepard arrived at the launch site around 5 a.m., 2 hours before the planned liftoff, while the Redstone was still taking fuel. Americans were aware of the historic nature of the flight, and crowds were gathering on the beaches. Cloud cover and then a faulty power supply unit led to an additional 2-hour delay. Shepard spent more than 4 hours stuck in his spacecraft on the ground.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Shepard was only weightless in space for 5 minutes, during which he had to check out his spacecraft's maneuvering capabilities and make several Earth observations. Alan Shepard was successfully recovered after a flight that lasted just 15 minutes and 22 seconds. He returned a national hero, 3 days later receiving a citation from President Kennedy.
I want to express, on behalf of us all...
NASA continued working with Gus Grissom on their second Mercury flight, which would be almost exactly the same suborbital flight Alan Shepard had made. Everyone knew that the first flight had been a very distant second to Yuri Gagarin's orbit, and a repeat hop into the Atlantic seemed pointless. But management argued that the Mercury capsule was being refined, and that flight testing would be beneficial. It had annoyed astronauts that the hatch was attached by 70 bolts. A new explosive bolt system would allow them to escape rapidly. But things in Washington were moving rapidly. Less than 3 weeks after America's first manned spaceflight, President Kennedy made an address to Congress.
First, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space.
Many at NASA were stunned by the president's declaration, knowing how much developmental work would have to unfold in such a short time. No one had even figured out how it could be done. In July 1961, NASA was preparing to send the US's second astronaut to fly in space. Gus Grissom had called his spacecraft Liberty Bell 7. There was no reason to think that this flight would differ in any way from Alan Shepard's. In addition to the explosive hatch, there was a new window, and the attitude controls had been refined in preparation for the orbital missions that would come when the Atlas booster was ready. During the 15-minute flight, all went according to plan, with the spacecraft splashing down just 5 kilometers beyond the predicted landing point. But the recovery procedure went badly wrong, with the hatch blowing early and the spacecraft taking on water. It became too heavy for the helicopter to lift and was cut loose. Grissom's spacesuit was filling with water when a second helicopter dropped a line. Grissom came under pressure. It was assumed he blew the hatch prematurely, which he strenuously denied. His fellow astronauts backed him, and today it is accepted that static electricity from the helicopter discharged as the capsule's antenna was cut as part of the recovery drill. This triggered the hatch's explosive bolts. Barely 2 weeks after Grissom's flight, the Soviets launched Vostok 2 with cosmonaut German Titov. He made 17 orbits, staying aloft for more than a day, returning safely. Again, it was headline news in the United States, further contributing to the nation's insecurity. Following Grissom's flight, there was a pause in the Mercury program. NASA was beginning a rapid expansion to accommodate the president's goal of a moon landing within the 1960s. It was now plainly obvious that the next manned mission should be an orbital flight, which meant waiting until the Atlas booster was reliable enough to carry an astronaut. NASA was also preparing the first in a new family of launchers, that would be crucial for the future Apollo missions. The large booster program had been renamed Saturn. As a completely new rocket, Saturn Apollo 1 was expected to experience problems, and tension in the blockhouse increased as the countdown progressed. Chief designer Wernher von Braun saw the new rocket as a test vehicle for new engines and new stages that were still in development. The launch and the flight went flawlessly. There were 10 launches of the Saturn I, and it was unprecedented in rocketry that not one of the new Saturns failed. At this early stage, no clear strategy had been set out for a moon landing. Different techniques were discussed. Most involved a linking up in Earth orbit of separate spacecraft. Orbital rendezvous was seen as very difficult, and one school of thought wanted to avoid rendezvous and just fly directly to the moon. A small group from the Langley Center eventually helped managers understand this method would be hugely expensive and not achievable by President Kennedy's deadline. The technique that was finally accepted called for a lunar landing craft that would rendezvous with a mother craft waiting in lunar orbit. Before that could happen, and after the Mercury program was completed, there would be a new space program to figure out how spacecraft in orbit could rendezvous. Plans for a new capsule emerged. It had a crew of 2, with the ability to maneuver and change its orbit. The new program became known as Gemini, yet the United States still had not put a human into orbit. After 2 unmanned Mercury test flights using the Atlas, NASA was ready to launch John Glenn on the US's first manned orbital flight. Again, crowds were filling the beaches near Cape Canaveral. Because this was to be an orbital flight, the space agency had established communication stations around the globe, including specially equipped ships. Coverage was not complete, with several mid-ocean black spots. As Glenn entered the capsule he had called Friendship 7, he carried with him a range of drugs to cover all eventualities. While the Russians had already made 2 orbital flights, they had not passed on any medical information.
T-minus 15 seconds. T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition. Godspeed, John Glenn.
The Atlas booster performed well, and Glenn was cleared to make the intended 3 orbits.
This is Friendship 7. I'm on straight manual control at present time.
Soon reliability problems arose with a thruster, and ground staff became concerned when a warning light indicated that Friendship 7's heat shield was loose.
Roger, I understand.
The capsule came down in the Atlantic 60 kilometers short of the intended target, with John Glenn safe and untroubled after almost 5 hours in space. Problems with the capsule were minor. Just days after Glenn's return from space, President Kennedy came to Cape Canaveral to present him with NASA's Distinguished Service Medal. The following month, scenes in New York were rapturous. To the engineers working on Project Mercury, the strengths and weaknesses of their spacecraft were becoming obvious. Its heat shield and the craft's aerodynamic shape had been successful. But as an experimental design, little thought had been given to ease of maintenance or reliability. The astronaut had to share his small compartment with almost every one of the subsystems required for spaceflight. When faults were picked up in testing, a single technician had to squeeze into the astronaut's couch to make repairs. And because space was limited, each system was entangled with the others. Still early in the Mercury program, time-consuming delays were slowing things down and inflating budgets. Mercury would be good for training astronauts and ground staff, but its main purpose was to fly longer and longer duration missions. The goal was 18 orbits, and McDonnell, the Mercury craft's builders, were working to modify the final capsule to achieve this. On May the 24th, 1962, Scott Carpenter was ready for the Mercury program's second orbital flight. Like John Glenn, Carpenter made 3 orbits, but he splashed down 400 kilometers from his intended landing site. Mission Control was not happy with his performance, and he never made another spaceflight. Even as the new Gemini spacecraft was taking shape, it had a list of complex tasks to achieve. As a new program, it was required to fit in between the final Mercury flight and the commencement of Apollo, so time was tight. Its chief designer, Jim Chamberlain, wanted as many Mercury engineers as possible to help in the layout of the Gemini craft. He knew they would give valuable insights. The plan was to stay close to the shape of the Mercury spacecraft, but to add an extra equipment module that would be discarded before re-entering the atmosphere. It contained, among other subsystems, fuel cell power supplies. Keeping the spacecraft's essentials outside the crew compartment allowed simpler maintenance and testing than in the Mercury capsule. The Gemini spacecraft was bigger and heavier than its predecessor, so it required a more powerful launcher. Fortunately, the Air Force was developing a new version of the Titan missile, which could lift the new spacecraft. It also had a pared-back simplicity that appeared to offer greater reliability. Called the Titan II, it was fueled by red-fuming nitric acid and Aerozine 50. These are known as hypergolic propellants. They can be stored for long periods at room temperature, which greatly simplifies launch procedures. But they are highly toxic. Gemini designers opted for ejector seats, dispensing with the elaborate and very heavy launch escape tower. Astronauts could make an emergency escape like pilots in a jet fighter. This system was tested many times, but the astronauts said the best thing about the Gemini escape system was that it never had to be used. Soon there was a second intake of astronauts. Different standards were used in their selection. As well as being test pilots, many had advanced degrees in engineering. All astronauts were given a specific aspect of the spacecraft or launch system as their own area of expertise. Gus Grissom's area was command and control of the Gemini spacecraft. The most crucial technique that the Gemini program had to master was rendezvous and docking with a target. His input greatly influenced design of the translational controller that was important during docking. In parallel with the development of the Gemini capsule was the adaptation of the Agena upper stage. It would serve as the target vehicle for Gemini rendezvous missions. As the Agena B, it had served effectively as a spy satellite. Its engine could be restarted in space, and when docked to the Gemini capsule, it would be able to boost it to a higher orbit. It would ride atop the Atlas that was now familiar to NASA through its role in the Mercury program. But getting the Atlas-Agena combination to function harmoniously would take time. Early in 1962, as part of NASA's rapid expansion, the Manned Spacecraft Center moved to Houston in Texas. On the 4th of July, a parade was held to welcome the NASA group. NASA management understood the importance of good public relations, especially with the huge outlays needed for the upcoming Gemini and Apollo programs. Astronauts complained about being pulled from training to be seen with politicians or to make speeches, but the senators and congressmen loved it, and the funds kept flowing. Early in August 1962, the Soviet Union launched a surprise called Vostok 3. A day later, they launched Vostok 4. The joint flights were to compare the cosmonauts' reactions to longer duration missions. Vostok 3 made 64 orbits, and Vostok 4 made 48 orbits. NASA feared the Soviets were attempting their own orbital rendezvous. In October 1962, NASA was preparing for the Mercury program's third orbital mission. Wally Schirra successfully made a flight of 6 orbits, landing safely in the Pacific where a small naval fleet was waiting. News of Schirra's flight was pushed off the front pages by disturbing developments in Cuba.
Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. Shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
If Americans needed a reminder why they were spending so much to catch up to the Soviet Union's lead in space technology, this was it. A new problem with the Titan II had emerged. Soon after launch, the acceleration began to fluctuate. 11 times a second, the rocket bounced, intermittently doubling the forces on the hardware. The phenomenon became known as pogo. While the technology might withstand the gyrations, NASA was not sure what a human passenger could take. Tests began. It was found that at even moderate pogo levels, astronauts' vision became impaired. Access to the control panel under such vibrations was impossible. Aside from the Titan's pogo issues, problems with poor ignition on the upper stage would also have to be solved before the booster could earn its human rating. Not all of the difficulties facing Gemini would be solved. An early proposal that seemed like a good idea was replacing the parachute with a Rogallo wing. This would allow the pilot to land the craft on an airstrip. Gus Grissom flew early trials which were promising, but the designers could not get the wing to unfold reliably. Testing eventually switched to parachutes, and the Gemini craft, like the Mercury capsules, would continue to land using the proven technology. In May 1963, Gordon Cooper was preparing to make the Mercury program's final spaceflight. There had been an extra Mercury mission scheduled, but it was realized that little would be learned. One of the lessons NASA had learned from Mercury was how limited the technology was. Spacecraft and booster checkout had been laborious, with prolonged intervals between launches. Engineers realized that there was room for improvement, and everyone in the Manned Spacecraft Center was looking to the future.
4. Holding momentarily at 4. We have ignition.
Keeping a human alive in space was all very well, but while the astronauts did run experiments during Mercury flights, there was little else for them to do. After a 22-orbit endurance test, the Mercury program came to an end.